All right, welcome everyone to our weekly reading of Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. Prometheus Rising presents a taxonomy of consciousness with 8 circuits and an implied evolutionary progression. We are reading it to explore ways to hack our consciousness for better living. I'm Bubble, also known as Alley Wurds. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I've worked with and written about Prometheus Rising over the past 5 years. Last week we read Chapter 16, The Snafu Principle. And if you missed it, you can look it up on our YouTube channel, and this session is also going to be recorded and uploaded. Let's start by taking a look at the exercises from Chapter 16 before we get on to Chapter 17. So Chapter 16 exercises start at the bottom of page 251. And the first one was, start collecting evidence that your phone is bugged. Number 2 was, everybody gets a letter occasionally that is slightly damaged. Assume that somebody is opening your mail and clumsily resealing it. 3. Look around for evidence that your coworkers or neighbors think you're a bit queer and are planning to have you committed to a mental hospital. 4. Try living a whole week with the program Everybody Likes Me and Tries to Help Me Achieve All of My Goals. 5. Try living a whole week with the program I have chosen to be aware of this particular reality. 6. Try living a day with the program I am God playing at being a human. I created every reality that I notice. Assume that God, in quotes, is the answer to DeFree John's question, who's the one living you now? 7. Try living forever with the metaprogram. Everything works out more perfectly than I plan it. Did anyone have a chance to do or maybe think about these exercises?
I think I only ever tried the first one that you were saying, like to think like my phone is bugged. Like you said, it's not that hard because I think it could just be the algorithms of like Facebook and stuff. But there's instances when I just think of something and I get an advertisement for it. So I mean, just being aware of that, maybe realize, maybe maybe it is bugged. I don't know.
At least in America, they are. The NSA is allowed to store everything that your phone records and everything that's ever been through your phone, and it's not considered an invasion of privacy legally until they actually look at it. So they have massive databases of everything that's ever gone through any device that's connected to the internet, and it's legal for them to do that, and then they just don't look at it, supposedly, until it becomes relevant to a case. So if you have a smartphone or like an Alexa or anything like that that can detect anything that waits in like a standby mode for your voice to activate it, has to be recording it all the time.
Yeah, it's mad that we live in those times that like we never have any privacy really.
Well, you can choose to have more privacy, I suppose, but you relinquish certain conveniences for that, which I suppose is not necessarily always bad.
That's true. Yeah.
Yes, definitely a balancing act. Well, let's give him like a slight verbal going over. So like the basic idea that it's playing with here is a lot of the same stuff that's been going over since the beginning, which is that you can change the way you view the world and that it can radically change your lived experience of it. And by choosing to constantly or consciously alter the way you process the information you receive, so like the mental programs, to use the language of the book, you can hopefully find stuff that works well for you. And I don't know, I don't want to overinterpret what Robert Anton Wilson imagined, but if you notice, there are a few there at the beginning that are effectively a simulation of paranoia. There is some sort of relationship between these exercises and some forms of mental illness, including number 4. So like, run a whole week with the program that Everybody Likes Me and Tries to Help Me Achieve All of My Goals. If that were to run unchecked for long enough, you would essentially become, well, it would probably work out differently for different people, but I could imagine someone becoming kind of manic or like a megalomaniac, like someone who's obnoxiously extroverted and just doesn't get it even if you don't like them and they're being annoying. So there are a lot of different mental disorders that can be framed in this sort of light as like a mental program that's running. And for someone that has it to the point where it's actually disorderly, obviously it's very difficult for them to switch programs to something that is more situationally useful. And that's a lot of the idea of metaprogramming, is changing your mental programs. All right. Does anyone have any questions or comments on that or anything else before we move into the next chapter?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. With that, then we will go to chapter 17. It starts on page 253. And we have a picture here of, it looks like an animal jumping through, I'm interpreting it as a portal, and then on the other side turning into a human, like a bald person with glasses who's smiling. All right, and then we have a quote from Nietzsche from his book Thus Spake Zarathustra. What is a man? A bridge between the ape and the superman, a bridge over an abyss. All right. So we'll start at 255. This chapter begins. Another perspective on domesticated primate evolution is provided by Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave. For convenience, Toffler reduces the muddle of human history into a model of three waves. It would be more accurate to refer to these waves as quantum jumps in energy coherence level. The first wave, Toffler says, took millennia to occur, but it finally transformed the larger part of humanity from the tribal stage, simple hunting, gathering primates, to the stage of large-scale agricultural, feudal civilizations. The second wave came much faster and in a few centuries, transformed almost all of humanity from feudal agricultural cottage economy to industrial urban market economy. The third wave, Toffler says, continues the trend toward acceleration and will happen in only a few decades. We call it the information explosion, the post-industrial economy. Each wave is faster by a factor of 10 than the previous wave, and each wave is more total in that it changes more people, changes them more completely, and in the process transforms our concept of human nature and human society. Each wave that Toffler describes can be considered a new quantum state with energy levels and reality dimensions lacking in the previous state and totally unpredictable from the previous state. The first wave mutated tribal men and women into serfs or into lords and ladies. It created a whole new social manifold that is so subtle and pervasive that anthropologists and sociologists can spend years studying its invisible aspects. And yet this transformation is so enormous that it is also visible to the most untrained eyes. You can't confuse a tribal human with a feudal human anymore than you can confuse a dog with a donkey. So too, the second wave created what Toffler wittily calls industriality, manifesting as industrial men and women who are visibly, tangibly as different from feudal or tribal humans as dolphins are from rose bushes or armadillos. The third wave, which began when Shannon and Wiener defined information and von Neumann designed the first programmable computer. It is well underway already. Home computers have become as common as TV sets by the 1980s. Now the net, computers talking to computers, is doubling every 4 months. This transformation again will be total. It will create a whole new man, a new woman, a new child, a new self, a new society, a new concept of work and energy and reality. The average man or woman of 1997 will be as obsolete in 2007 as the medieval serfs are now. What we consider normal jobs, normal social roles, normal humanity, will be as archaic as a horde of alchemists, smithies, town criers, courtiers, and barber surgeons arriving in our midst today. Of course, Toffler does not claim that the computer is the whole of the third wave, but merely that it is the synecdoche or paradigm of what is happening. In this sense, the factory was the synecdoche of the second wave. It was not merely the agent by which industriality spread across the world and multiplied our collective wealth and ilth, it also became the model for everything else. Our schools are mini factories, or models of factories, because the main job was, when they were founded, to prepare people for factory work. The schools, in fact, were necessary because while feudalism does not require literacy of the masses, industrialism does. Similarly, offices were modeled on factories and kept factory hours, even when this had little or nothing to do with how the offices could be most efficiently managed. And in general, industriality, the reality of the industrial age, moved everybody into the robot lockstep of the factory system. We have a footnote here. A freelance writer can obviously work any hours, but the very successful and very excellent John D. MacDonald said in a recent interview that he always writes from 9 to 5 because it seems natural to him. The factory time clock has gotten into MacDonald's neurons. The present author, after 20 years in factory-like work offices, works any hours of the day or night when the spirit moves him, but never starts at 9 or stops at 5, to avoid relapsing into the habits of his past. Back to the main text. Industriality is still so pervasive that it is, as McLuhan noted, mostly invisible. For instance, the feudal age never progressed beyond chamber music, trios, quartets, etc. The modern symphony, with its huge orchestra, its Promethean themes, its godlike conductor, capitalist, its concert master, foreman, its string section, moving in harmony with its brass section, is a beautiful artistic expression of modes of mass human organization appearing usually in less beautiful forms in the factory assembly line. The factory also demanded cities, massive concentrations of labor in one place, which made the symphony economically possible. The aristocrat could not afford and/or could not conceive keeping more than the very few musicians necessary for chamber music. Beethoven's cosmic optimism not only expresses the age of reason out of which industriality emerged, the very orchestras he wrote for were paradigms of industrial styles of organization. Of course, industrialism, the second wave, produced much ilth along with its new wealth, and most of the wealth was or appropriated by a minority. However, this may pain socialists. It was inevitable in a domesticated primate species. A few alpha males can always see their own advantage more clearly than the majority can see their collective interest. Nonetheless, as industrial reality has spread, socialism has followed in its wake. Whether the reader likes this or not, and the author, being upfront about his prejudices, admits that he does not like it, this also is inevitable. When huge wealth is palpably being created in vaster accumulations than ever before in history, there is sure to be increased grumbling against the alpha males, and more attempts to seize what they have selfishly or expropriated. Even among baboons, this pattern has been observed. The alpha male who is too obnoxious gets beaten up by a coalition of younger males and thrown out of the pack to forage alone. Neither capitalist industriality nor socialist industriality have been able to give humanity what most of us really want: liberty and justice, freedom and abolition of poverty, continued growth and continued security. In looking at capitalism versus socialism, we are always confronted with a dilemma, not a choice. The third wave can and will transcend this problem with industrialism. The third wave will be neither capitalist nor socialist, nor some milk-water blend of the two. It will demand a whole new economy, just as feudalism created an economy unknown to tribal humanity, and industrialism created the two competing economies of capitalism and socialism, both unguessed and unpredictable from the perspective of the feudal stage. In 1977, Dr. Ilya I'm going to say this wrong, Prigogine? I don't know. This doctor won the Nobel Prize in Physical Chemistry. Perhaps he should have won a Nobel Prize for intelligent optimism. Dr. Prigogine's work deals with the processes we have been discussing, the emergence of negative entropy, coherent order, out of stochastic processes. but he has taken a giant leap beyond the pioneering insights of Schrödinger, Wiener, Shannon, and Bateson. Any organized system, according to Prigogine, exists in dynamic tension between entropy and negentropy, between chaos and information. The more complex the system, the greater is its instability. Prigogine demonstrated this mathematically, but in everyday terms, what he means is that, for instance, it is easier to lead 2 children through a department store than 20 children. Or, a toothpick house of 101 pieces is less stable than a smaller toothpick house of 10 pieces. Instability is not always bad. In fact, it is absolutely necessary for evolution to occur. Insect societies are highly stable and have not evolved at all in several million years. Human societies are highly unstable and are in continuous evolution. Prigogine demonstrates that the evolutionary value of instability by his concept of dissipative structure. A dissipative structure is highly complex and therefore highly unstable. The more complex it is, the more unstable it is. Mathematically, certainly, the more unstable, the more likely it is to change, to evolve. So a dissipative structure, something that's going to dissipate or fall apart, is highly complex and therefore unstable. And then less complex things tend to be less stable or less unstable. So things that are simpler are more stable and therefore don't evolve as much. So complexity is, according to this author, Prigogine, is able to allow for change, evolution, hopefully. All dissipative structures are teetering perpetually between self-destruction and reorganization on a higher level of information coherence. If that sounds grim, it isn't really. Prigogine's math is highly optimistic. He shows that the more complex structures, such as our world-round human society today, midway between second-wave industriality and the emerging third wave, are mathematically more likely, much more likely, to dissipate into higher coherence than into self-destruction. In other words, in the intellectual conflict between utopians and dystopians, the mathematical odds actually are on the side of utopians. Our human world is so information-rich, coherent, that it is almost certain to collapse into even higher coherence, not into chaos and self-destruction. Prigogine is the mathematical demonstration of McLuhan's intuition that many seeming symptoms of breakdown are actually harbingers of breakthrough. A note to confirmed pessimists: Prigogine's analysis is based on probability theory and hence is not certain. Thus, if you have found these lyrical pages unduly alarming, take comfort in the thought that, although human success is highly probable, there is still a small chance that we can blow ourselves up or that your favorite apocalyptic scenarios might still occur, despite the general trend toward higher coherence and higher intelligence. Meanwhile, of course, even if humanity seems condemned to overall success, you can still mess up your personal life. Nothing in this book is an attempt to prevent the really resolute misery addicts from continuing their pursuit of frustration and failure. Alright, let's go back up to the top and recap. And this one's really information dense, and let's see if we have any comments or questions after that. So this chapter is called Quantum Evolution, and we have a quote from Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is sort of like a novella play kind of thing that Nietzsche wrote, that says, man is a bridge between the ape and the Superman, a bridge over an abyss. And the idea is that Zarathustra is walking around and talking to a bunch of people, and he's being kind of pretentious, but he's trying to explain his philosophy about how at least some individual humans are able to transcend beyond the bulk of humanity and become, the original term is Ubermensch, but sometimes it gets translated as Superman, or Overman, to become this thing that is like more than human. And there are some examples, historical figures that Nietzsche claims may have been Ubermen, such as, I know Jesus is one of them, which is ironic if you read enough Nietzsche. But from there, this chapter is talking about Domesticated Primate Evolution. So a lot of this book is about trying to build a map that can be used to forecast the direction into which humanity can evolve as a collective, as rather than individual people. But how can we as a species become something greater? Which is similar to what Nietzsche was trying to talk about with that novella Thus Spake Zarathustra. And it's also kind of what Robert Anton Wilson says is what goes with his neurogenetic circuit, which he puts as the sixth circuit in this book. So like trying to view and think about humanity collectively. I'm going slightly out of order, but it follows logically from that. That's why he was talking about like capitalism and socialism a little bit. And there's a good quote that I'm going to paraphrase if I don't see the exact spot, where he talks about how individual alpha males, in quotes, are better able to predict their own. Oh, here we go. No, I didn't see the exact sense, but oh, there we go. A few alpha males can always see their own advantage more clearly than the majority can see their collective interest. So it's easier for us as domesticated primates, as Homo sapiens, to reify like hierarchy structures to work within like the second circuit and create these hierarchical structures that benefit a few at the top and then keep that system in place. And he's characterizing capitalism as one way to do that, as well as feudalism, than it is for the bulk of people to understand themselves collectively in a way that is functional, that's healthy, that actually produces positive, helpful change, and produces the kind of structures that Prigogine was talking about. And I apologize, I'm sure I'm butchering his name. Where dissipative structures are highly unstable, and because of that, they're able to evolve. They're able to change in a way that is helpful, like human society has. And that's sort of like a quick summary. Let's go back through it and see if there are some things I left out. Throughout this theme, there are themes about how technology keeps going faster and faster. So you can see he's saying that each wave is faster by a factor of 10 than the previous wave. And he starts talking about how the internet was just becoming a thing there, and by the mid-1980s, home computers became as common as TV sets. And then he's talking about how computers talking to each other, the internet, the rate at which that is happening has been doubling every 4 months, at least at the time of writing. And he's saying that the average man or woman of 1997 will be as obsolete in 2007 as the medieval serf is now. And I'm not sure things have evolved. They definitely have not changed quite as fast as Robert Anton Wilson was predicting at the time of writing this book. But there are definite social differences in terms of how people relate to each other due to the prevalence of the internet. And so he was talking about how there are multiple waves of the evolution of human society, from Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave. And the first wave transformed the larger part of humanity from the tribal stage to large-scale agricultural civilization. So people began actually settling down and farming, and thus allowed for everything else to occur. And then there are various political critiques at each wave as to like what should have happened instead. Then we have the second wave, which came much faster, and it was like feudal agricultural cottage economy to industrial urban market economy. And then again, there are various critiques about maybe something else should have happened. And then the third wave, Toffler was writing about, they were expecting to have it happen with the computing evolution, the post-industrial economy. And the idea was that the computer was sort of like a symbol for what was going to happen with this next step, moving from an industrialized world to whatever the post-industrialized economy, society is like. And we have a quote here from Robert Anton Wilson saying, each wave that Toffler describes can be considered a new quantum state, with energy levels and reality dimensions lacking in the previous state and totally unpredictable from the previous state. So Robert Anton Wilson in this last circuit, which is notoriously confusing, is using sort of quantum mechanics as a metaphor. Quanta is derived actually from a word in Finnegan's Wake, amusingly. So it's an amusing coincidence how the initial language of quantum mechanics, the initial naming of it anyways, came from, the word was quark, which comes from the Latin qua for what, and then also like hark, if you know those words. So that's how quantum mechanics got named, or at least how the quark got named. And the idea is that there's various energy levels that things stabilize at. Each like quantum is like a spot, almost like saying the universe is pixelated, and I'm not a physicist, so I'm sure butchering that as well. But the idea is that that can be used as a metaphor for other things, meaning that society can sort of like ramp up almost exponentially and then reach like a new plateau where it's at this other state with completely different kinds of behavior. So the behavior of human society at the level of hunter-gatherers is one thing, and then enough knowledge and information builds up that we become an agricultural society, and that creates all these other emergent phenomena that were entirely unpredictable just from observing hunter-gatherers. And the idea is that that happened again, producing an industrialized society with the Industrial Revolution. And now the same thing again is happening with computers, the internet, smartphones, and all of that. Eventually, that is going to ramp up to a point that it creates an entirely new kind of human relation system, a new quantum level, a new quantum state. And that's the essential metaphor that he's using there from quantum mechanics. He kept using this pun, industriality, from industrial or industriality or reality. The idea is that the Industrial Revolution created new reality tunnels. I think that is the bulk of what we talked about here so far. And he used the words wealth and ilth a lot. If you weren't here when we talked about that, or maybe you missed that session or just forgot it. Wealth and ilth are like things that are produced. Ilth is like a pun on wealth. Wealth kind of sounds like wealth, so things that you produce that are good for people and society at large. And ilth are like the bad things, like ill. So like something, there might be a very helpful medicine that is produced, so that's wealth, but the way that it's produced might have very harmful byproducts, so ilth, just to give like an example.
I do have one question, Bubble. You explained, Ross, the use of the word quantum here as kind of, this critical mass point from where things just change in an unexpected direction, but onto a grander scale, I suppose. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's how I feel he's using it, at least here.
Yeah, so I guess we've noticed so far in the book, he kind of throws the word quantum around quite a lot, and it's actually one of the more reasonable irks that people might have. Do you think he has kind of a consistent use of it throughout the book, or in your study of his material, did you come across multiple uses or meanings that he might imply? This is one of those words that I see a lot in this text, but every time I feel like I'm getting it, then something comes along that kind of shakes that up again, and I'm sure there's more thought to it than just an old man using a cool gimmick word or whatever, so I was just wondering if you could explain some more about his use of it.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's an issue in a lot of spiritual or metaphysical books like to call reference to quantum mechanics because it is spooky and cool, and it's not even new anymore. But yeah, I feel like most of the time that he brings up quantum mechanics, he is using it as a way to talk about. He's using it as a metaphor for the way electrons behave in quantum mechanics, in that he refers to things moving to specific states, sort of like there's I might be getting this wrong because again I'm not a physicist, but I think there's like a Planck unit distance that's like the minimum distance things can move in quantum mechanics, or maybe it's energy levels is what I'm thinking. So there's the idea of like discreteness as opposed to like there's discrete mathematics and continuous mathematics. So like if you think of the number pi, like its decimal goes on forever. Like you could use that in a continuous number system where you could use like any decimal place you want. Whereas something like discrete mathematics might only use like 0, 1, and 2 and like no fractions or anything. So there's this a sense of discrete levels or plateaus that comes from the way he uses the term. And then there's also the idea of non-locality and entanglement. So he does use it in multiple ways. So he uses it to refer to things that are connected to each other or are in multiple places at the same time. If you know about like quantumly entangled electrons, they can be like on different sides of the planet and you move one and then the other one moves in the same way, seemingly instantly. It's a good thing to bring up. It is a weird, often misunderstood topic, probably by me as well. Does anyone else have any questions or comments or anything we could talk about here? This chapter is a little bit short, so if you have anything to bring up, definitely go for it.
I noticed that he was like saying at the start that how we evolved in general, and that as of now we're sort of reaching this stage where the internet and computers are doing everything for us, and it's almost like we're digging our own grave in that sense. You could say we're evolving to make things easier, but it's also we can see where it's going. It's like I heard something Elon Musk or something like Neuralink, for example. You've probably heard of that, but like it'll do all the thinking for us. So at what point, how easy do we want it? I mean, I think there's a point where things get too easy, and like if someone wants to know something, they search it on Google, like, and they didn't have it years ago. So I don't know. It's like very convenient, all this stuff, and it's almost making knowledge less. I don't know what the word is, but like, you know what I mean?
What's really
it's like,
amusing. I didn't want to cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, but you can sort of see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, people have been talking about that. So Plato, in particular, the person who wrote the plays about Socrates having his arguments with people, was amusingly against written language, ironically, because prior to that there was an oral tradition. Like everybody memorized the poems of Homer, and everyone like memorized all of this information. They all knew basically the same information and could recite from heart, at least like specific passages anyways, depending on the person. And that was gradually lost as writing became more prominent. And there were definitely mental faculties that humanity collectively lost as we developed writing and eventually the printing press. You just don't need to memorize stuff anymore like that. And it's the same thing kind of happening again. So there's this like externalization of information and ability from the single organism of the human that externalizes it into a collective thing. So like the third semantic time binding circuit, if you want to use the language of the book. And I definitely agree with what you're saying. It will definitely and has definitely eroded faculties in some ways, depending on how you use it. But at the same token, that frees up having to memorize things or just having easy access to information or tools to let you do and learn other things. So like, let's say, to use an example that is sort of close to me, let's say that you wanted to like do an entire opera on yourself or something. Not on yourself, but like by yourself. You couldn't do that. I mean, you can't really do that right now. Technically you could, but it wouldn't be great. But historically, you would have to get together an orchestra, you'd have to get to a lot of singers, you might have someone write the libretto, like the text, and then you have to set it to music, and you have to get everyone to practice all of that, right? But today, you could just input the text into an AI, and it would sing it badly, and you could also use little bits of audio that you recorded and have it do music. and set it together. And then there are AIs that create visual video content based on the prompts you put in. What's going to happen, in my prediction, is that as a lot of these tools and information technologies progress, at least for creative people, it'll be a lot more about you determining the big picture ideas and curating than it will be about like your own internal specific abilities to do those things. So like the next Beethoven could be just organizing and curating the way an artificial intelligence is creating sounds.
I suppose it opens up a lot more doors for us too, you know? I mean, if all this information is, if we know that it's available to us, we don't have to memorize it and we can sort of set our focus elsewhere, you know? So it's good and bad,
exactly.
I suppose.
And of course, you do want to memorize some things, but a lot of stuff you can just have on hand.
Yeah, it was life-changing for me
Right,
when in school they let us use the calculator at some point, you know, and before that it was all calculus in your head, and after that, like, something changed. And at some point I realized, well, I need to go back to spending energy on this, you know, or I'm really going to turn into, you know, a sponge mentally. Yeah, it was crazy to realize. But I guess it's the same with going to the gym, right? If you don't lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it, kind of thing. Yeah.
Remember when they said you won't always have a calculator? Remember they used to say that to us in school. Now we have smartphones now that have, you know.
Yes, and you'll have a calculator
I
in your
know.
brain. Oh wait, I already got one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The important thing,
I think
in my opinion, is to just use that freed up mental energy for something else. All right, we got like 20 minutes-ish left, so let's try to finish it, and then maybe we'll have time for more questions and comments. But I do appreciate the conversation. Let's pick back up on 259. So we were just talking about how Prigoghine's analysis of like complex things being unstable and thus more easily allowing change, unlike stable systems, like he gave the example of insects. Insect society has more or less apparently been the same as far back as we can detect. But since his analysis is based on probability theory, it's not certain, and who knows what will happen for sure. All right. The latest cosmological evidence indicates that our sun and its planets, including Earth, condensed out of a cloud of galactic dust and gas about 5 or 6 billion years ago. It appears that the first forms of unicellular life, the first dawnings of Circuit 1 biosurvival consciousness, appeared about 3.4 billion years ago. Vertebrates began to appear with Circuit 2 emotional territorial consciousness about 0.5 billion years ago, 500 million years ago. The emergence of Circuit 3 human intelligence, language, and thought seems to have begun about 100,000 years ago. The fully human domesticated primate, Homo sapiens, with Circuit 4 moral consciousness, may be about 30,000 years old or even more recent. Circuits 5 through 8 have appeared within historical times. All of these figures are subject to revision as science advances, but the rough proportions between them are not likely to be changing much, and these proportions are staggering. As has often been pointed out, if we condense this evolutionary scenario into a 24-hour day beginning at midnight, life itself does not appear until a little before noon, and all of human history, from grunting, club-wielding ape men from Africa to Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon, occurs in the last half of the last second before midnight strikes again and the day ends. This model is misleading in that it assumes the present is an end, which is highly unlikely. Even without space migration, the lifespan of Earth's biosphere is expected to be somewhere between 10 and 15 billion years more before the sun ceases to support life here. Taking the sun's expected lifespan of about 20 billion years as our model to be mapped onto a single day, we find that it's now around 8 in the morning. Life has been mostly unconscious until now, operating on autopilot, as it were. But in the last million years, the last few seconds on this model, signs of consciousness and awakening are beginning to appear. The universe is so constructed as to be able to see itself. Spencer Brown once noted, The emergence of the neurosomatic, neurogenetic, and metaprogramming circuits is the universe's way of seeing itself ever more clearly and totally to decide where it is going. Dr. Isaac Asimov notes in his Genetic Code that there seems to be a 60-year cycle between the first understanding of a new scientific principle and the transformation of the world by that principle. For instance, Oersted discovered electromagnetic equivalence, the fact that electricity can be converted to magnetism and magnetism to electricity, in 1820. 60 years later, in 1880, electrical generators were in wide use and the Industrial Revolution had peaked. The telegraph and telephone were already invented and our age of mass communication was dawning. Similarly, in 1883, Thomas Edison first noted the so-called Edison Effect, the key to electronic as distinct from electrical engineering. 60 years later. That was in 1883. 60 years later, in 1943, electronic technology was appearing everywhere. Its primitive form in the entertainment sphere, radio, had enjoyed a 20-year triumph and was about to be phased out by television. In 1896, Becquerel noted the radioactivity of uranium. 60 years later, 2 cities had been destroyed by atomic bombs and nuclear plants were beginning to be built. This was a contribution to ilth, not wealth. In 1903, the Wright brothers got their monoplane off the ground for a few minutes. 60 years later, in 1963, jetliners carrying over 100 passengers were normal. Assuming gambling, guesstimating that this 60-year cycle is normal, we can predict. Shannon and Viner created the mathematical foundations of cybernetics in 1948. 60 years later, in 2008, cybernetization of the world, as complete as the electrification of the 19th century, will have jumped us to a new energy level, a new social reality, as Toffler predicts. Hoffman discovered LSD and the chemical control of consciousness in 1943. 60 years later, in 2003, with alteration in consciousness, every alteration. So he's saying that in 60 years, so in 2003, every alteration in consciousness imaginable will be possible by ingesting the proper chemicals. McKay had the first success in expanding lifespan of laboratory rats in 1938. 60 years later, in 1998, longevity pills may be routinely available in all drugstores. DNA was identified in 1944. 60 years later, in 2004, every type of genetic engineering should be as routine as electronic engineering is today. The latest attempt to estimate the rate of information acceleration, the manifestation of coherence, was made by French economist Georges Andelay for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in 1973. Anderley arbitrarily assumes that all the bits of information possessed by humanity at the beginning of the Christian era, 1 AD, could be considered his unit of measurement. He made that information pool 1 unit in our fund of knowledge. It took until 1500 AD, Anderley discovered, for the accumulation of bits of information to add up to 2 units in our fund. So everything that humans knew at 1 AD is 1 unit, and then 1500 years later, supposedly in this system, or in this model, we're up to 2 units. It only required 250 years more, to 1750, for our bank of knowledge to double again to 4 units. The next doubling took 150 years, and by 1900, humanity had 8 units in its information capital account. The next doubling took only 50 years, and by 1950 we had 16 units. The next doubling took only 10 years, and by 1960 we had 32 units. The next doubling took 7 years, and by 1967 we had 64 units. This was coincidentally the height of the first youth revolution, when reality maps began breaking down everywhere on the planet, and wild new maps were hurtling at us from all directions. This brings us to a picture of an exponential function, roughly, trying to map out sort of the accumulated information according to this way of viewing history. So at the left we have units of knowledge. Far bottom left corner is supposed to be 1 AD, is 1 unit of information that humanity had accumulated, and then it's predicting that we're going to have, we'll say, like 100 units around the year 2000. This is kind of, I'm not sure how you actually measure that, but all right. And this is called the information explosion. In the next 6-year period, 1967 to 1973, our intellectual bank account again doubled to 128 units. At this point, Enderle completed his study. Dr. Alvin Silverstein has estimated that if Enderle's graph is projected ahead 70 years, human knowledge should increase a millionfold. That is, we should have 128 million times more knowledge than we had in the year of Jesus' birth. Longevity drugs will probably arrive in time for you to live through the biggest evolutionary quantum jump of all. It is only reasonable to assume that the higher circuits of the nervous system, neurosomatic holistic awareness, neurogenetic evolutionary vision, metaprogramming flexibility, are developing to allow us to cope with this deluge of higher information and potential higher coherence. Toffler's third wave is only the sociological aspect of a mutation that is also biological and spiritual. We are going to live a lot longer than we have expected, and we are going to get a lot smarter. A whole new reality will emerge from these mutations. Right, that brings us to the end of the chapter, except for the exercises. I'm going to jump back and recap what we just read, and then we'll see if we have any more questions or comments. All right, so we picked back up on page 259. And a lot of what we just read was looking at multiple exponential growth patterns in how technology and human information, human knowledge has expanded or exploded, if you look at this graph here. So, but this isn't just human. So it's interesting if you look at near the middle, bottom middle of page 259, it appears that the first forms of unicellular life, the first dawnings of Circuit 1 biosurvival consciousness, appeared 3.4 billion years ago. So what he's doing here is he's not really talking about humanity. He's talking about the universe as an organism, or a universe as a becoming organism, becoming aware of itself, and that all of these patterns of information flow, they aren't humans doing it. There's something, some sort of emergent phenomena that all come together to create all of these patterns, but it's not right to call any one thing, like any one animal or planet or even plant or planet, sort of like the nexus of it. It is all of these patterns that are together creating tools that he's calling circuits. And these circuits aren't just inside of your head. Circuit 1 biosurvival consciousness was a tool that appeared with the first unicellular life, according to what he's saying. Vertebrates began to appear with Circuit 2 emotional territorial consciousness. So vertebrates are the accretion of these tools coming together again to establish a new way of the universe understanding itself, this sort of emotional territorial consciousness of hierarchy and that sort of thing. The fact that humans developed Circuit 3 is almost coincidental, but aspects of the universe created ways of storing information beyond the very small scale DNA. And this links back to the chapter that was on the neurogenetic circuit, where I think I described humanity as being a prosthetic limb to DNA, and that DNA is this information technology that is creating all of life, at least on Earth, as a tool to propagate and advance itself and expand itself. And he says these figures are subject to revision as science advances, but he's expecting that these rough proportions between them are not likely to have changed much. So we might discover that vertebrates appeared in like a different millennium or something, but the idea is that it's going faster and faster. So 3.4 billion years was Circuit 1, according to this model. half a billion year ago was circuit 2. 100,000 years ago, circuit 3. And the idea is that it's going to keep going faster and faster and faster. So maybe only 1,000 years from now, if you want to keep going at this rate, maybe even less, maybe 100 years, almost all of humanity, or whatever the dominant tool is that the biosphere is using to understand itself, will be around circuit 5 or 6. And then it should keep going faster and faster until it creates this sort of explosion. And then the collective entity of the biosphere, not just on Earth, but like throughout the universe, if this model is correct, it'll just keep going and expanding ever outwards into whatever weird, currently incomprehensible stuff it becomes. And that's the basic idea. And he talks about technology. There's apparently a 60-year pattern. Dr. Isaac Asimov notes in his genetic code that there seems to be a 60-year cycle between the first understanding of a new scientific principle and then transformation of the world by that principle. And even that appeared to be happening a little bit quicker as time went on, when you started looking at television versus radio, although maybe broadcast media could be considered a single thing. We talked in a different chapter about that a little bit, how in the field of science, it's often the case that when a new discovery is made, like quantum mechanics or general relativity or whatever, the old generation of scientists often have to die off before whatever the newest thing that is more useful as a scientific tool is able to fully establish itself. And of course, plenty of other theories or ideas are generated that are just not that useful for whatever reason and are not adopted. Yeah, and that's a lot of it. And for people that have not seen the whole thing, it's worth bringing up that Robert Anton Wilson was fairly optimistic about the universe. He expected that life extension technology would get to the point where his life would be extended to the hundreds until technology was developed to make him immortal, and he died in the early 2000s. So this book is it's an artifact of a time. It's a cultural document, and you can't really you just don't take it as scripture. You know, it's a great book, but you know, everything has its flaws. And that's the basic idea. Do we have any questions or comments?
It's just, I was thinking, it's like, what, in a nutshell, what would be like the thing that's causing this, like, you know, acceleration? Like you were saying, and it even says on that chart, you know, like, it seems to be speeding up this evolution of consciousness. Like almost, it's like the acceleration itself is getting faster, if that makes sense. It's like, what? I don't understand how that could happen, you know? It's almost too linear to be true. Like, you wouldn't
Yeah,
expect it to be so
exactly.
smooth.
So I can only hypothesize, but and you're right that the acceleration itself is getting faster if you're looking at an exponential graph. It's not just like a quadratic, it's not just like accelerating at the same rate all the time, it's actually accelerating faster and faster. If you think about it this way, and for anyone that is familiar with many different traditions, this will sound, you've heard this before, but like, let's say you start out with a single unit of information. So like in number theory, you might have like the element 1 or the element 0, even, to use a better example, and then just like nothing at all, the empty set. So by starting out with 0, you're able to say, oh, I have 0, the number, but I also can have like not even 0. And then those two things together, they're able to produce a third thing, right? Now that you have 3 different elements, they're able to combine together. The term is like combinatorically. There are more combinations that you can make out of 3 things. Like you can have 0 and 1, you can have 0 in the empty set, you can have 1 in the empty set, and you start creating these different combinations, and it multiplies each time. Because like if you think about like atoms sticking together, once you have a few different configurations, you can start combining the configurations and create, it multiplies upon itself how quickly it can combine other things together, until you're sticking more and more complicated chunks of information or ideas And that is one explanation.
Yeah, I think one reason might also be, technologically, just the way we are able to retain information and the speed at which we can process it. I think those are pretty relevant factors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. By having everything recorded, you don't have to keep it all in your head, and thus a single person or a group of people can combine larger and larger combinations of things to produce new things faster.
And, I
If
heard
you,
that get his name, Robert. I pronounce it. Robert was saying there that he expected like immortality by like the year 2000s, but I've seen some things that like they have that sort of technology. They just keep it for themselves. Like I don't know if you've heard of quantum made beds or something, like things like that. But apparently, they won't release to the public as special interest and all that stuff are just selfish. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was true.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, but the leading researchers on life extension, and I think his name is Aubrey de Grey, is the person I'm thinking of. The basic response that the leading researchers on life extension give is that we have grown exponentially in our use of longevity tools, but we've also grown exponentially in our understanding of how complicated the problem is. So like in the 1980s, we did not understand all of the details of how to extend life, and we have resolved or at least made significant progress towards a lot of the life extension problems that they knew about in the 80s, but we've also just discovered a lot more things that are like, oh, this thing also goes bad as you get older. So we are making a lot of progress on the things we know about, but we keep discovering other issues that cause aging. So it's like two exponential graphs fighting against each other.
I suppose you wouldn't want to be immortal anyway, would you? Like realistically,
I mean, I'd like to be able to choose when I die. Like, I wouldn't want to be stuck living forever. Do we have any questions or comments from other people in the audience?
I'm actually good right now. I'm just taking in the information.
Yeah, I don't have any more questions myself.
Okay, let's take a look at the exercises, and then we will revisit them next week. So there are only 3 this time. The first one says, make a list of 10 areas in which your thinking feeling is conservative. Guess how soon the world will change so totally that those ideas will seem not merely conservative but irrelevant, as the theological debates of 300 AD now seem irrelevant. And I think that might be a reference to people used to debate about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, or the precise way in which the Virgin Mary received the Holy Spirit, which allowed her to bear Jesus Christ. Number 2 says, make a list of 10 areas in which your conceptualizing is radical. Guess how soon the world will change so totally that you will seem conservative in those areas. So first do it for your thinking feeling, then do it for your conceptualizing. 3. Accept the longevity crisis, or accept the longevity hypothesis. Imagine you are going to live at least 300 years. How much of that time do you want to spend loafing? How many different jobs would you like to work at? How many sports, arts, or sciences you never had time for would you then find the time for, or the time to enjoy? So think about how soon the ways you think, feel, and conceptualize are going to become irrelevant, assuming humanity keeps progressing at a similar rate. And then if you could live 300 years, how would that change the way you structure your life? Interesting questions. And then the chapter after this brings us to the actual discussion of the non-local quantum circuit. Any last questions or comments? If not, that's perfectly okay. All right. Thank you for coming to today's session. Recording will be up on YouTube in the coming days. Join us again next week, same day and time. You can follow what I do outside VRchat over at my Linktree. That's linktree/elephantwords. lanktr.ee/elephantwords. If you haven't already, join the VRM Discord with the URL in the lobby. Consider supporting VRM by donating, supporting on Patreon, or becoming a volunteer. More information at vrmystery.school/support. This is the end of today's session, but feel free to mingle in the lounge.